The house was quiet at midnight, the way great houses are quiet, not silent, but holding its breath. Lydia Cavendish-Wray moved along the upper corridor in her dressing gown, one hand trailing the wall, her feet finding the cold floorboards by memory. She had lived 11 years at Ravenscroft Park and knew every creak, every draft, every place where the candlelight from a half-open door fell across the stone like a warning. She was not looking for anything particular, only water, only the simple errand of a woman who could not sleep. And yet, when she reached the landing above the study and heard her husband's voice drift upward through the gap in the door, she stopped as though the house itself had placed a hand on her arm. Philip's voice was low and certain, the voice of a man who believed himself alone, and what he said entered her body not as a blow, but as a key turning in a lock she had spent 10 years building. "My heart has belonged to another for 6 years, Philip said. "I owe Lydia her freedom." Lydia did not move. She looked down at her own hand resting against the wall and watched the shadow it cast in the thin candlelight. Steady, precise, the hand of a woman who had already decided what to do, and understood, with a clarity that had nothing of grief in it, that the moment she had been preparing for had finally arrived. She returned to her room. She crossed to the writing desk by the window. She opened the top drawer and removed a leather portfolio that had been waiting there, patient and complete, for 3 years. She sat down. She began to write. She had begun building the exit in the 2nd year of their marriage. It had not been a dramatic decision. There was no single night of revelation, no confrontation that broke something irreparably. Only a gradual comprehension, arriving the way cold arrives in autumn, 1 degree at a time, that the partnership she had believed she was entering did not exist. Philip was not unkind. That was the precise cruelty of it. He was courteous at dinner, attentive at public occasions, entirely correct in every observable way. He simply did not see her. He looked in her direction and registered a wife, a function, a presence that organized his household and required nothing further. Lydia had understood this slowly, and then, all at once, in the morning she understood it completely. She had gone to the estate ledgers and found 3 errors in the quarterly accounts. Errors that had been compounding quietly for 8 months. And she had corrected them and said nothing and begun. The first document she prepared was a letter to a London solicitor, a man recommended by her father's former clerk, whose discretion her father had trusted and whose competence she had verified through her own inquiries before she wrote a single line. She retained him on a private account, funded through the household allowance she managed with a precision Philip had never thought to examine. The letter was brief, specific, and entirely without sentiment. She instructed him to begin preparing the framework for a separate maintenance instrument, a legal document that would establish her right to independent support in the event of a separation, and to file the preliminary correspondence in his office records under her maiden name. The solicitor wrote back within a fortnight. His reply was careful and thorough, and she recognized in it the tone of a man who had seen this situation before, who understood exactly what she was doing and intended to help her do it properly. That letter was filed in London 7 years ago. It was still there. The portfolio she now held in her lap contained the accumulated architecture of a decade's quiet work. There was the separate maintenance instrument itself, drafted in full and reviewed twice, the language precise enough to survive challenge in the Court of Chancery. There was a documented record of her contributions to Ravenscroft. 3 years of corrected ledgers, annotated in her hand, with dates and figures. 5 years of tenancy correspondence she had managed when Philip's land agent fell ill and never fully recovered his competence. A summary of the financial improvements traceable directly to her administration. There were independent powers of attorney, prepared against the possibility that she might need to act on her own behalf before any legal proceedings concluded. And there was the intellectual record, the evidence she had assembled of her own output across 9 years of writing. She had published her first essay in the 4th year of their marriage, under the name L. Cavendish, her mother's family name, made usefully ambiguous by the initial. The essay concerned the legal treatment of tenancy agreements and the specific provisions that left agricultural laborers without recourse when estate management changed hands. She had written it in the mornings, at this same desk, in the hours before Philip rose, because the argument had been building in her for 2 years, and she had nowhere else to put it. The periodical had accepted it within 3 weeks. She had read the letter of acceptance at this desk, alone, and then folded it and placed it in the portfolio, and gone down to breakfast, and said nothing. There were 11 essays now. 4 of them had been cited in parliamentary submissions. 1 had been referenced in a formal legal brief by a reform-minded solicitor whose name she had not yet encountered in person, but whose work she had followed with close attention. His name was James Ashford. She sealed the letter to her solicitor before dawn, pressed her father's seal into the wax, not Philip's seal, never Philip's seal, and set the portfolio beside her traveling trunk. 2 days remained before she would need them. She used both days to finish what she was already in the middle of, a correspondence with a tenant farmer in the North Field whose drainage dispute had been pending for 4 months, and a set of corrections to the winter accounts that would otherwise sit unresolved until spring. She completed both. She left them on the estate manager's desk in neat order, with a covering note in her clearest hand. Then she went downstairs and waited for Philip to find the courage to speak to her directly. He did not find it himself. He arrived in the formal drawing room 3 days after the night on the landing, accompanied by his solicitor, a thin man named Greville, whose leather case had the worn look of a document carrier that had seen too many of these mornings. Philip was dressed formally, which told Lydia that someone had advised him on the gravity of the occasion. Isolde, his mother, sat to his left in the high-backed chair she favored for occasions requiring the full weight of her presence. 70 years of Wray family authority arranged in silk and disapproval, watching the door as Lydia entered. Philip stood when she came in. The courtesy was genuine, which made it worse. "Lydia," he said, "I am grateful that you are willing to meet this way. I know it cannot be easy." "It is a legal proceeding," Lydia said. "I am quite composed." Greville opened his case. Isolde straightened. Philip drew a breath that Lydia recognized as the breath of a man about to deliver terms he believed were generous. "Before we discuss what Lord Ravenscroft wishes to offer," Lydia said, "I believe we should first discuss what already belongs to me." She set the portfolio on the table. The sound it made was not dramatic. It was simply a leather folder placed on a polished surface. But Greville's hands stilled over his papers, and Isolde's eyes moved to it with an expression that Lydia had never seen on her face before. Not hostility, not contempt, but something that recognized itself as surprise and did not enjoy the sensation. "My solicitor," Lydia said, "is waiting in the entrance hall. With your permission." She did not wait for Philip's permission. She nodded to the footman at the door, and a moment later a compact, gray-haired man entered the room, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been preparing for this meeting for 7 years. His name was Alderton, and he set his own case beside Lydia's portfolio and opened it without ceremony. "I will address the solicitors directly," Lydia said, and she did. She did not look at Philip. She did not look at Isolde. She turned to Greville and to Alderton, and she spoke for 11 minutes without notes, because she did not need them. She named the ledger corrections by quarter and by year. She described the tenancy correspondence she had managed for 3 consecutive years while the estate agent's health declined, and named 4 specific tenants whose disputes had been resolved through her direct intervention. She enumerated the financial improvements, the drainage investment in the North Field, the renegotiated grain contracts in the 2nd year of her management, the reduction in outstanding arrears from 14 accounts to 2. And she cited the figures precisely, because she had put them in the portfolio, and Alderton had the portfolio, and every number was documented and correct. Greville looked at his papers. Then he looked at Alderton. Then he looked at Philip. "My lord," Greville said, in a voice kept very careful, "her documentation appears to be— I would need to verify, of course, but on initial review— It is correct on every point," Alderton said, without raising his voice. Isolde said nothing. Lydia looked at her once, only once, and saw in her mother-in-law's face the precise moment that a woman who had spent 30 years managing what other people saw and did not see recognized that she had failed to manage this. The woman she had taken for a quiet, invisible administrator had been building a legal architecture underneath Ravenscroft's floors for a decade. And Isolde had never thought to look down. Lydia left Ravenscroft Park that afternoon. Her lady's maid, Agnes, had packed 2 trunks and the writing desk. The trunks went into the carriage first, then the desk, wrapped in canvas against the January cold. Lydia descended the front steps in her traveling coat, her gloves already on, her face arranged into the expression that Agnes privately called her working face, present and unreachable. In the entrance hall she paused. She removed her wedding ring and placed it inside a small envelope she had prepared that morning. She set the envelope on the hall table, beside the silver card tray where Philip left his correspondence. She did not seal it. There was nothing she wished to write inside. The carriage moved down the gravel drive, and Lydia watched Ravenscroft Park diminish through the rear window, its stone face pale against the winter sky. And she thought of every morning she had sat at that desk in the upper room and written the words that nobody there would ever read. She did not look away until the gates closed behind her. London received her without ceremony, which was exactly what she wanted. The furnished rooms above the tailor's shop in Bloomsbury were modest by any standard she had previously occupied. 2 rooms and a small parlor, the ceilings lower than she was accustomed to, the street noise present at all hours. But they had a writing desk positioned near the window that caught the morning light, and she had brought her own chair, and within 3 days she had arranged the space to suit her work. James Ashford's offices were a 12-minute walk through streets that smelled of coal smoke and bread. She had written to him before leaving Ravenscroft, a formal letter explaining her situation and requesting a consultation on the maintenance instrument. He had replied by return post, brief and direct, confirming an appointment for the following Tuesday, and noting that his firm was familiar with the relevant legal framework. He was younger than she had expected. 35, perhaps, with the kind of focused attention that Lydia associated with people who had learned early that time spent on the wrong thing was time genuinely lost. He stood when she entered, gestured to the chair across from his desk, and waited for her to sit before he sat. These were small things. She noticed them. "Mrs. Wray," he said. She had signed her correspondence with her own surname, not Philip's title, and he had registered the choice. "I have reviewed the maintenance instrument your solicitor forwarded. The drafting is thorough. Whoever prepared this was thinking several steps ahead." "I prepared it," Lydia said. James looked at her for a moment. "With Mr. Alderton's guidance? With his review and signature?" she said. "The framework was mine." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. He opened the file on his desk, and they began to work. The first consultation lasted 2 hours. The second lasted 3. By the fourth meeting, the legal strategy was clear enough that they had begun, almost without intending to discuss the essays. It began when James cited an argument from a pamphlet on tenancy reform, a specific construction about the relationship between documented contribution and legal claim. And Lydia completed the sentence before he finished it. James set down his pen. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise. "The pamphlet," he said carefully, "was published under the name L. Cavendish." "It was," Lydia said. James did not say the name aloud. He looked back at his papers, and the quiet between them was the quiet of a man who had drawn a conclusion he intended to keep to himself until the person in front of him was ready to confirm it. He asked her, instead, whether 2 forthcoming reform pamphlets, one on the legal standing of women's documented contributions to marital property, one on the procedural gaps in the Court of Chancery's treatment of maintenance claims, might benefit from arguments she had developed in her unpublished notes. "They would benefit considerably," Lydia said. "Then I would like to include them," James said, "with your direction on the framing." They arranged to meet twice the following week. It was on the second of those mornings that Lydia descended the front steps of her building and found a man standing on the opposite pavement who was not waiting for the tailor's shop to open and was not reading the newspaper he held. He looked at her building with the particular attention of someone who had been told to look at it. Agnes, behind Lydia, made a small sound. James arrived for their meeting 3 minutes later, coming from the direction of the Strand, and took in the situation at a glance. He set his briefcase down on the step beside Lydia's and stood there, not between her and the man, not in any posture that announced itself, simply present, visible, beside her. They stood together for perhaps 90 seconds, long enough for the man across the street to understand that his presence had been registered. The man folded his newspaper and walked away. James picked up his briefcase. "Shall we go up?" he said. "Yes," Lydia said. The reformist gathering was held in a gaslit assembly room near Gray's Inn, the kind of room where the air smelled of paper and argument, and the chairs were arranged without regard for comfort. Lydia arrived with James, who moved through the gathering with the ease of a man known to most of the people in it, and then separated from him, by design, by preference, to move through the room on her own. She was not there to be seen. She was there to listen. The first conversation she passed was between 2 barristers and a pamphlet publisher, standing near the window with copies of a newly distributed essay in their hands. "The Cavendish argument on documented contribution," one of the barristers was saying, tapping the page, "is the most practically useful thing published on this subject in 5 years. Whoever L. Cavendish is, he understands how courts actually read evidence." Lydia moved on. She accepted a glass of wine she did not drink. Near the fireplace, 3 women, reformers by their conversation, sharp and well-read, were debating a specific passage from the essay on tenancy rights. One of them disagreed with the framing of the 3rd section. She was wrong, and her objection rested on a misreading of the legal precedent Lydia had cited. And Lydia stood 18 inches away and said nothing and listened to all 3 of them arrive, after 4 minutes of argument, at a conclusion that was almost exactly right. None of them looked at her. She was crossing toward the door when James found her. He did not ask how the evening had been. He looked at her face and understood it. And then he took her hand, briefly, quietly, the way a person touches something they want to be certain is real, and said, "I am glad you exist." She looked at him. The gas lamps were behind him, and the room was loud, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not heard those words directed at her before. Not in that particular arrangement, not meaning precisely that. "Thank you," she said, and meant it fully. In the carriage afterward, James placed a covering letter on the seat between them, a submission form for a legal periodical, requesting the first essay she had prepared under her own direction rather than the L. Cavendish framework. The periodical was reputable and widely read. The submission was ready. All it needed was a signature. Lydia picked up the pen. She wrote Lydia Ray at the bottom of the covering letter, and the letters looked strange to her. Her own name, in public, attached to her own work. And then she set the pen down. She folded the letter and held it in her lap for the remainder of the carriage ride, and did not send it. Not yet. The following week, in James's offices, Mrs. Hartwell arrived. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with the practical, unhurried manner of someone who had managed a difficult life competently, and had no patience left for anything that wasted time. She had a tenancy dispute that had been resolved 3 years earlier. Lydia knew the case by reputation, had in fact cited the outcome in one of her unpublished notes as an example of successful application of the arguments she had been developing. Mrs. Hartwell had fought the dispute alone, with limited resources, against an estate agent who had assumed she would give up. She had not given up. The case had been resolved in her favor, partly through arguments drawn from an L. Cavendish essay that James's firm had submitted in the relevant proceedings. Mrs. Hartwell came into the office, looked at Lydia, and stopped walking. "You are L. Cavendish?" she said. Not a question. One of the clerks looked up from his desk. The second clerk's pen ceased moving. James, standing beside the window, did not look surprised. He looked at Lydia with the careful, patient expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment and had decided some time ago that it was not his to hurry. "I have waited a very long time to thank you," Mrs. Hartwell said. 3 years. I did not know your name, and then I began to suspect it, and then I made certain. My granddaughter is living in the house I kept because of the case you helped build." She paused. "I thought you should know that." The room was very still. The coal fire settled in the grate. Lydia looked at Mrs. Hartwell, at the directness of her, at the patience it must have taken to carry this gratitude for 3 years and deliver it without fanfare. And something that had been held at a careful distance for a very long time moved closer. "Thank you," Lydia said. "I am glad the outcome held." She did not redirect or deflect or qualify. She accepted it, fully and without reservation, and felt the acceptance settle somewhere in her chest like a thing that had finally been put down after a very long carry. James met her eyes across the room. She understood, in that look, that he had known for weeks, perhaps longer, and had said nothing, and had waited because he had recognized that the moment of acknowledgement needed to belong to her. His office had been a place of legal strategy, of careful professional distance, of work pursued under the neutral banner of reform. It was still all of those things. But it was also, from this moment, a place where she was known. Isolde filed the formal legal challenge on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of February. The document arrived at Alderton's office by mid-morning and at James's desk by noon. Lydia was already there when the messenger came, and she read the filing with the focus she brought to all documents, line by line, without expression, noting the specific legal arguments and the procedural strategy behind each one. The instrument was well drafted. Whoever had prepared it understood the weaknesses in a maintenance claim and had constructed the challenge to exploit them with precision. Isolde had retained good counsel. James read the filing after her. He set it down and was quiet for a moment. "She is arguing that your contributions to Ravenscroft were not legally distinguishable from ordinary household management," he said, "and that the maintenance instrument was prepared without proper disclosure to Lord Ravenscroft." "Both arguments are answerable," Lydia said. "They are," James said, "but answering them requires assembling the counter-documentation tonight. The preliminary hearing is Thursday." He crossed to her side of the desk and placed both hands on her shoulders. A brief, deliberate pressure, 10 seconds at most, the kind of steadying that asks nothing and offers everything. And then he moved to the cabinet where the files were kept and began to pull folders. They worked through the night. The counter-documentation assembled itself under their hands, with the logic of something that had been waiting to be used. 3 years of pre-filed public records, correspondence between Lydia and the Ravenscroft estate agent, submitted to the county registry as part of a routine land management filing, bearing dates that predated the separation by years. Tenancy correspondence in Lydia's hand, signed with her name, covering disputes that the estate agent's own records listed as resolved under her direction. Financial ledgers with her corrections, not copies, not transcriptions, but the original ledgers, which Alderton had removed from Ravenscroft under the terms of the discovery provision in the maintenance instrument, and which showed clearly, in the contrast between the uncorrected figures and the corrected ones, exactly what she had contributed and when. James had sent the published L. Cavendish essays to Philip's club by hand that same afternoon. Not as a legal document, but as a fact. Philip had never read them. James had decided, with a quiet precision that Lydia recognized as its own kind of argument, that he should. By 3 in the morning, the counter-documentation was complete. The fire had burned low. The street outside was hushed. Lydia set down the last page, became aware for the first time in several hours of the cold, and of the fact that she had not eaten since midday, and of James across the desk. His jacket removed, his sleeves turned back, reading through the final summary with the concentration of a man who would not stop until it was right. She looked at him and thought, with a directness that surprised her, that she trusted him. Not the way she had trusted Alderton, competently, professionally, with the reasonable confidence of a client in her solicitor, differently, in the way that you trust someone who saw your work before they saw your face and valued it, and then saw your face and valued that too, and never confused the two. She did not say this. She poured 2 cups of cold tea from the pot on the side table and put one in front of him, and he looked up and said, "Thank you," and they went back to work. Philip came to James's offices the morning after reading the essays. He arrived without announcement, which Lydia suspected was itself a departure from his habits. Philip had always preferred the armor of prior arrangement. He was shown into the front room, and Lydia agreed to receive him there with the door open onto the corridor, where Agnes was sitting with her mending, and James was visible at his desk beyond the glass partition. Philip stood when she entered. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the night revising a version of events he had held for 11 years. "I did not know," he said. Lydia sat down. She did not invite him to sit. "Which part?" she asked. "Any of it." He moved his hand toward the chair across from her and then stopped. "The essays, the ledgers, the tenants. Pharaoh told me last autumn that the drainage in the north field had been your arrangement. I didn't ask what he meant." He paused. "I should have asked." "Yes," Lydia said. "The essay on tenancy rights," Philip said. "The third one, I read it last night. The argument about documented contribution, I recognize the phrasing. You used almost the same construction in a letter to me 4 years ago about the Alderton grain contracts. I did, Lydia said. You did not reply to that letter. Philip was quiet for a moment. I know. I spent 10 years, Lydia said, and her voice was even, each word placed with care, making certain that my absence from your notice would not be my destruction. I built the maintenance instrument because I understood, by the 2nd year of our marriage, that if you ever decided I was no longer necessary, I would have no legal standing and no documented claim to anything I had contributed. I built the intellectual record because the work existed and it deserved to exist under a name, even if that name was not quite mine. She looked at him steadily. I did not do it to punish you. I did it because I needed to survive. Philip looked at the floor. Then he looked at her. I am not contesting the proceedings, he said. I know, Lydia said. Mr. Alderton informed me this morning. He stood for another moment, as though there were something further he intended to say, and then apparently found that there was not. He nodded, formally, carefully, the nod of a man who understood that he had forfeited the right to anything warmer, and left the room. The day before the Chancery hearing, Lydia took out the covering letter she had folded in the carriage 6 weeks earlier. She smoothed it on the desk. She picked up the pen and signed it. Lydia Wray. She read it back once. Then she sealed it and sent it to the periodical by the afternoon post. The Court of Chancery confirmed the maintenance instrument on a Thursday morning in the first week of April. The hearing lasted 4 hours, which was shorter than James had prepared for, because Philip's solicitor, Greville, still thin, still carrying the worn leather case, acknowledged on the record, with the careful precision of a man reading from a document he could not dispute, that the documentation submitted by Lydia's counsel was correct on every point. The tenancy records were dated and verified. The financial contributions were documented and specific. The maintenance instrument had been prepared with full legal competence and filed in advance of any dispute. There was, Greville said, in the voice of a man delivering a verdict he had not written, no procedural basis for the challenge. Isolde was not present. Lydia had noted the absence when she entered. Philip sat in the gallery, not at the table, not as a party to the proceedings, simply present. And Lydia did not look at him during the hearing. But she was aware of him there, in the way that you are aware of the final page of a chapter you have been reading for 11 years. On the steps outside, the spring rain was light and steady. The kind of rain that doesn't announce itself, but makes everything wet. Lydia descended with Alderton on her left, and James 2 steps behind. And she had reached the bottom and was turning toward the street when she became aware of Lady Hesterfield, a friend of Isolde's, a woman whose social authority in the relevant circles was considerable, moving toward her with the purposeful trajectory of someone who has prepared a public statement and intends to deliver it. Lydia had prepared for this too. There was a press correspondent standing near the bottom of the steps, a young man with a notebook who had been covering the Chancery listings. Lydia turned to him before Lady Hesterfield had covered half the distance between them. "My name is Lydia Wray," she said, clearly and without haste. "I am the author of the essays published under the name L. Cavendish, including the essay on documented contribution and legal standing currently in print in the Law Reform Quarterly under my name. If your publication is interested in the story of how those essays came to be written, I am prepared to speak about it." The correspondent's pencil was already moving. Lady Hesterfield stopped. The rain fell on the steps and on the stone balustrade and on the street below, and the city went on around them with its ordinary noise. And Lydia stood in it with her name in the air. spoken by her own voice, belonging to no one else. James was beside her. He did not speak. He did not need to. He was simply there in the rain, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And she was grateful for it in a way that had nothing of dependence in it. Grateful the way you are grateful for good light, for a room with a fire, for the presence of someone who makes the work possible and asks nothing in return that you are not glad to give. 6 weeks later, in the parlor above the tailor's shop, 2 lamps were burning. The room had changed since January. There was a second desk now, set facing Lydia's across the width of the window, close enough that papers could be passed between them without either person rising. The arrangement had been James's suggestion, offered with the practical directness that she had come to understand was how he expressed everything that mattered to him. Not through declaration, but through the concrete act of showing up, pulling up a chair, and doing the work beside her. They had been working for 2 hours when James set down his pen and looked at her across the desk. "The periodical has written again," he said. "They want a second essay. And there is a parliamentary committee. I have been asked to submit a brief on the documented contribution question, and I would like, if you are willing, to submit it under both our names." Lydia looked at him. "Both names," she said. "Ashford and Wray," James said. "If that suits you." "It suits me very well," she said. He was still looking at her, and she recognized the look. It was the look of a man who had something further to say and was deciding how to say it. And she had noticed, over the months of their acquaintance, that James Ashford, who was eloquent and precise about everything else, became careful and slightly slow when he was about to say something that had nothing to do with the law. "Lydia," he said, "I want to tell you." She kissed him before he finished the sentence. It was not impulsive. Nothing Lydia did was impulsive. She had thought about it, with the same careful attention she brought to every decision, and she had concluded that whatever he was about to say was true, and that she already knew it, and that there was more value in the act than in the words. He was still for a fraction of a second, surprised, she thought, or simply registering. And then he was not still at all, and his hand came up to the side of her face with a gentleness that she felt in her throat. And outside the window, the Bloomsbury Street went on about its business in the April evening. When she drew back, James looked at her with an expression she did not have a word for, which was unusual because she had words for most things. "I was going to say," he said, "that I have never worked beside someone I admired more." "I know," Lydia said. "I know you were." She turned back to her desk. On the surface before her was a fresh page, clean and white in the lamplight, and at the top of it she had written, that morning, the title of the essay the periodical was waiting for. Below the title, in the space where a name goes, she had written, for the first time, on a page that would be read, on a page that would be printed and distributed and cited and kept, her own name. Not L. Cavendish, not Lady Ravenscroft, not the wife of anyone, or the daughter of anyone, or the carefully invisible administrator of a house that had never quite been hers. Lydia Wray. The lamp burned steadily. James's pen began to move on his side of the desk. The street below was quiet, and the room was warm, and the page was waiting, and she picked up her pen and began.